All right, so I want to welcome everybody back to Black American or African American Studies with me, The Forecast, back with the 10th session. And if you missed any of the previous sessions, then I suggest you go back and watch it, the whole thing, for it to make sense or to get the complete story. And I want to thank everybody who showed me support doing this, showed me love. You know, these are hard to do and it does take a lot of time. So I want to thank everybody who does show me support with it. And of course, I always got to encourage everybody, you know, to come up with their own kind of curriculum. You know, anything that you think we're missing or you think that our children should be learning, whether it be business or history, math, whatever it may be, science, I encourage you to create your own courses. Now, even though we've been focusing on the history of Black people in America, we definitely need to talk about Black people fighting back on a global scale. Because what we have to realize is there are Black people throughout history that have always fought back, no matter where they were in the world. Now, even though the demographics were much different in places in the Caribbean, some people argue that slavery was even harsher there than it was in America. Not to compare the two, but even though Black people made up about 7/8 of these populations, only as much as 3% of Black people was considered free in these Caribbean islands. And rumors about how Black people were treated on the plantations over there were infamous, right? And a lot of times, a lot of slave owners threatened to send rebellious slaves over there to be broken. And we're going to touch on that a little bit next time when we see people like George Washington do it with his slaves. But even though today they try to make places like Haiti look poverty-stricken and poor and, you know, they just can't do anything. But during the 1700s, Haiti was the wealthiest colony and was producing most of the world's sugar. And these sugar plantations was some of the sickest plantations there were.
In the summer of 1789, when Haiti was still the dormant colony of Saint-Domingue, it was France that grabbed the world's attention. Parisian mobs rioted against the French king and against their own desperate poverty. Chanting slogans for liberty, equality, and brotherhood, they sparked a revolution that would fill history books for centuries to come. What was a dangerous idea in France was even more dangerous in its slave-holding colonies off the coast of Florida, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and an island known as the Pearl of the Antilles. Today, the western half is Haiti. Then it was the French colony of Saint-Domingue.
Sailors would come off the ships. The first people they would talk to, the people they would work with as they were unloading the ships, were enslaved people. So there are reports who were describing the events that have been going on in Paris to the enslaved that are working alongside of them.
Few intended colonial slaves should take democratic ideas to heart. Far too much was at stake. Sugar greased the wheels of the 18th century economy, and Saint-Domingue was the sugar capital of the world. Some blacks managed to escape slavery. Many had been born free, fathered by white planters. Others had gained freedom through their own wits or talents.
In 1789, there were about 40,000 white people and about 30,000 colored people who were, of course, their sons and cousins and so on and so forth, who were landowners themselves, many of them slave owners themselves, many of them very effective businessmen.
On the night of August 22nd, 1791, 1,000 enslaved Africans attacked their masters. The rebel numbers grew from 1,000 to 20,000 as newly liberated slaves burned cane fields and refineries. Whites and mixed-race people fled to the capital city for mutual protection. From there, they watched firestorms on all horizons.
And with them trading so much sugar, they would just treat the slaves horribly and forcing them to work to the point where, slaves generally had a 3-year lifespan. And after they died, they just bring in more and work them to death. Now, after the Europeans had what they called the French Revolution, the enslaved population in Haiti heard about it and was even more inspired to fight, especially since they had been fighting for their freedom. Now, even though only a small percentage of black people was considered free, most of that population was the mulatto population. See, unlike the English, who just called everybody Negroes and just did this one drop rule, the French handled it different. And the children that they had with enslaved women, right, a lot of times they would give them benefits over everybody else, right, creating what I guess some people would call a buffer class. Now, many of the plantation owners and a lot of white people didn't even live on this island. And they had this mixed race population to basically maintain control for them. Some of the slave owner kids who inherited the plantations never even seen the plantations themselves. And it was actually the mulatto population, and many of them owned slaves themselves. And a lot of them made sure that the system kept going like it was already going. Now, even though this mixed race group was treated better than fully black people, right, they still were under white people. They still had to refer to them as sir and ma'am and master and all of that stuff. But they were still treated as second-class citizens. After their French Revolution, they actually passed a law in Paris that basically said mulatto people get treated as equal as everybody else and equal protection under French law. Now, this pissed off a lot of the French slave owners, especially the ones with plantations in places like Haiti, because they felt like no mulatto should be treated as equal with them. And some of them were mad enough to even talk about seceding from France and starting their own kind of government. Now, even though the mulattoes weren't accepted by the white French slave owners, the mulattoes didn't want to give up their slaves either, which was the fully black people, right? They still wanted to maintain that hierarchy. They just wanted to be on the same level as whites. And after all, they are their parents, their brothers and sisters, their cousins, their family, all of that. And as a group, the mixed race people owned at least 10% of the enslaved people in Haiti. And, it's just like the same thing with the colorist argument, that we even see sometimes today, right? The lighter skin you are, the more benefits you got and the better you were treated. The darker you are, the worse you were treated. Now, don't get me wrong, even though this was generally a class and an issue amongst people, I'm not saying every single person. Just like not every single fully black person was on the same side. Because there were some fully black people who were doing the same. Trying to dress, walk, and talk and act like the French. And a few of them even owned slaves, even though French law did not protect their right to own property. But they tried to practice all the same methods as the French. And when the revolution did get started, some of them even fought with the French against the rebels. But they learned, along with the mulattoes, a lesson it seems like we still have to learn today. They will never accept us as the same as them. They didn't see them as equal to them. And they were never going to give them the same rights and benefits. But a lot of black people realized that even back then. And a lot of enslaved people ended up escaping and organizing with each other in swampy areas so they wouldn't be caught. But they met and they organized and they planned to fight back. Now, one of the areas they met, and forgive my pronunciation, Boy-Cayman, and again, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, but that's where a priest named Duddy Bookman led the ceremony and offered his prayer, get them mentally prepared before leading them into battle.
The God who created the earth, who created the sun that gives us light, the God who holds up the oceans, who make the thunder roar, our God, who has ears to hear, You who are hidden in the clouds, who watch us from where you are. You see all that the white has made us suffer. The white man's God asked him to commit crimes, but the God within us wants to do good. Our God, who is so good, so just, he ordered us to avenge our wrong. It is he who will direct our arms and bring us the victory. It is he who will assist us. We all should throw away the image of the white man's God, who is so pitiless. Listen to the voice for liberty that sings in all our hearts. This prayer was prayed August 14th, 1791. This was the prayer that called to action the Haitian Revolution, which started on August 22nd, 1791. Long live our ancestors, Dutty Boukman.
Now, during the ceremony, they perform voodoo rituals. And by the way, voodoo is not some negative or bad thing. And it's not necessarily some spooked out thing. But anyway, they perform these rituals to prepare themselves mentally for what they were about to do. And in this case, they called on the spirit of Ogun, which they were basically calling on the spirit of a warrior to come and help them in battle. And they also made a vow of silence with each other that nobody would say anything, no snitching, until it was time to go down. And once the rebellion actually started, they got momentum really fast. Nearly 100,000 people joined them to help them fight back. And they ended up killing nearly 4,000 white people and destroyed about 900 plantations.
Colonial whites felt profoundly betrayed. Some, such as a planter's wife named Madame de Rouvray, began discussing radical thoughts of their own.
The National Assembly is committed to destroying our lives as masters, so much so that secession from France might be necessary. The slave owners of America, I hope, will band together to stop this contagion of liberty.
Boukman Dutty was a slave and a voodoo priest.
Throw away the image of the God of the whites who thirsts for our tears, and listen to the voice of liberty which speaks in the hearts of all of us.
In August 1791, as Saint-Domingue's white and mixed-race population squared off for a showdown, Boukman called together slaves from neighboring plantations. They'd been kidnapped from different parts of Africa, and the voodoo religion was their common culture.
Le vaudou, c'est l'esprit de nos ancêtres, c'est une religion. C'est le mode de vie de l'Haïtien. C'est plus qu'une religion, c'est notre façon de vivre, c'est notre force. Le vaudou est libérateur, le vaudou est dignité, le vaudou est sagesse, et le vaudou, c'est notre tradition.
Boukman had called them to an area called Wakaima. First on the agenda was strategy.
That ceremony of Wakaima is the first Haitian Congress, the beginning of the revolution.
C'est dans cette réunion où l'Africain décide de n'être plus esclave, d'être libre, déjà là dans la tête, de casser cette chaîne dans la tête, de dire voilà, à partir de cette cérémonie, on prend l'Africain a pris son destin en main.
Haitian tradition says the slaves of Saint-Domingue planned that night to revolt. They timed their uprising to start on multiple plantations in 2 weeks' time. And they swore each other to secrecy.
The God of the white man calls him to commit crimes. Our God orders revenge. He will direct our hands. He will aid us.
On the night of August 22nd, 1791, 1,000 enslaved Africans attacked their masters.
Les esclaves empoisonnaient, les esclaves piquaient, les esclaves tuaient, les esclaves voulaient leur indépendance.
For them to be free, they have to have the same amount of violence that you exerted on them. That's why the revolution was very brutal. This is that hatred in the first day that came out.
The rebel numbers grew from 1,000 to 20,000 as newly liberated slaves burned cane fields and refineries in order to destroy the system that had enslaved them. Within 3 days, the most profitable plantations in the Americas had been laid waste. 184 sugar plantations and 1,000 coffee farms. Whites and mixed-race people fled to the capital city for mutual protection. From there, they watched firestorms on all horizons.
You've got a fiery cataclysm of enormous scale. I mean, the people on ships in the harbor supposedly could read their mail by the light of these fires that were, 10, 15, 20 miles away, to give you some faint idea of what this would have been like if you were there.
Now, their revolution had so much of an impact from the very beginning that friends started offering them citizenship, hoping it'll make them stop. Now, they took it right back a few months later, and then they just tried to send troops to go in and take control of the land. But by then, it was already too late, and the people had burned down the ports. So it was very hard for them to get in. Now, before we go too far with it, and we're going to come back to this in a second, but one thing we got to understand is this revolution was a long time coming. And this certainly wasn't even the first rebellion in Haiti. Now, decades before the revolution, a brother named Francois Mackendal, and again, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, I was colonized by the British, not the French. But Francois Mackendal freed himself and was determined to fight back against the Europeans. So he started teaching other slaves how to poison slave owners and overseers without them finding out.
He called himself the Black Messiah. Mackendal declared war on the French, leading raids on plantations and poisonings throughout the colony. But not everyone would join the revolution. The free blacks and mulattoes had been treated well by certain planters. They had property and money. Without their support, Mackendal's forces could not afford artillery, so instead of guns, Mackendal chose to use poison. This man is a voodoo priest and claims he becomes possessed with the spirit of Mackendal. His family is reportedly among the very few still in possession of the oral history. He says that Mackendal abandoned Haiti because he could not get the people to unite as one.
Chaque nèg cette petite roche comme ça et puis bon Dieu 20 août vient arriver et puis 10 faits ici, 10 faits ici, 10 faits ici. 10 faits ici, 10 faits pendant esclave pendant ces temps noirs mourir, esclave mourir avec bon coup d'armes français au te gagné. Et puis Mackendal pendant dans marronnage là. L'aile ouais bataille là, trop noirs mourir. C'est laisse à venir présenter avec Agaou dans tête on loi qui est Agaou. Ouais ba nous so.
After 12 years of raids and small attacks, he planned a major assault, distributing packets of poison to thousands throughout Saint-Domingue. His plan was to poison the French, and while they were in the throes of death, his forces would descend from the hills to finish the battle. The French fought back by torturing slaves relentlessly for information. And at a dance called Calenda, similar perhaps to this one, held at the Dufresne plantation, a slave betrayed Mackendal. Her name was Assam, and she brought him tafia, the strong drink made from cane juice. His senses dulled, Mackendal was an easy target for his enemies. He was then taken by guards and tied up in the office of the plantation. The men went to get soldiers, But when they returned, the ropes were on the ground and Mackendal was gone. The dogs were brought in and a full search of the area was launched. Mackendal was captured. He was about 30 years old. After a mock trial, Mackendal was taken here to the center of town to be burned at the stake. Slaves were gathered from throughout the colony to witness the punishment of their devoted leader. When Mackendal was brought out in chains, he was brash and fearless, and he talked to the crowd of slaves. The day was January 20, 1758. He made a promise to all those present, saying that he would return as a mosquito to do more damage than ever before. The fire was lit around him, and the flames leapt higher and higher until he was completely engulfed. Then suddenly, with a loud cry, Mackendal broke free and leaped out of the fire. The slaves claimed he jumped into the crowd and escaped. The French soldiers claimed they retrieved him and threw him back into the fire. Mackendal was never seen again. 33 years later, a voodoo priest by the name of Boukman gathered heads of the secret societies at Bois Caiman, the same place where Mackendal drew crowds of slaves. Boukman began the revolution with the same maroon colony Mackendal had trained and organized before. This time, all blacks united.
Now, Mackendal was a warrior in his own rights, and I don't know if it's true, but when they were about to kill him and they asked him if he had any last words, he said, "I'm going to come back as a mosquito just so I can do more damage." And he showed no fear. And I'm not going to lie, if you want things to change, you can't have less than that mindset. But Mackendal used his knowledge of nature and of plants and taught others how to poison the slave owners without being caught. He was already planning the revolution 40 years before the revolution happened. And he knew since it would be hard for him to get weapons, he was trying to organize the people using poison as their main weapon. Now, eventually, another enslaved person snitched on him. And when they were about to execute him, that's when he gave those last words that I'm going to come back as a mosquito to do more damage. But some say he escaped and went into the areas that later Dutty Boukman started building up his troops. Now, Mackendal put so much fear in Europeans, including the ones in America, that Georgia ended up passing a law to forbid black people from knowing about plants and anything really that they can use to poison them. Like, they literally made having knowledge about plants and nature illegal. But anyway, like 40-something years later, now Dutty Boukman is leading the people and led them into battle until he was captured. Now, they cut off his head and put it on a pole and put it in the middle of town, thinking it was going to scare or intimidate the other rebels and get them to stop fighting. But it only pissed them off and it made them want to fight harder. Now, understand, as poor as they try to make it look now, at the time, Haiti was the richest colony. So, of course, France didn't want to lose it. But you know how European greed goes. The British also saw how lucrative Haiti was, so they wanted in on some of that money. So these Haitian soldiers decided to use France and Britain feud against each other to their advantage. And by using them fighting each other, the Haitians were able to take control of more of the land. And pretty much during this time, the streets were like a battlefield. So since France was also fighting Britain for Haiti, or Hispaniola, they just didn't have enough power to stop the Haitian Revolution. So at first, France tried to offer amnesty to Haitian soldiers if they laid down their weapons and peacefully surrendered to slavery. But of course, nobody was going to do that. Who would peacefully become your slave just because? Especially when you're gaining more control of the land. So then the French captured about 3,000 people and tried to force them back into slavery. But countless other men, women, and children, even the elderly, were beheaded and chopped up into pieces. And of course, they were trying to send a message intimidating them by beheading children and elderly and chopping their bodies up. By then, it was so many Haitians joining the revolution that they could not be stopped. Especially with France fighting with Britain and that white-on-white crime. Now, France got so desperate, they started using the same tactics as America used in the Revolutionary War. And they started offering freedom to any black person who would help them fight. But the thing is, why would they help them when the Haitian rebels already controlled nearly 1/3 of the land? They might as well fight for themselves, not for France. Now, eventually Spain jumped in and they tried to go to war with France too. And you already know European greed. They saw how much money they was making in Haiti and all of them wanted control. But these other European nations was also mad that France would even make black people an offer for freedom, no matter what the circumstances. Even though the French really didn't mean it and it didn't last but a few months. But Spain was afraid that black people in the Dominican Republic would start doing the same thing and demanding their freedom. Now, after Dutty Boukman's death, Toussaint Louverture took over as leader of the Haitian Revolution.
Toussaint Louverture was born in 1743 in Breda, Saint-Domingue. This was a French colony on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola until 1804, when it became the independent nation of Haiti. Louverture was the leader of the Haitian independence movement that occurred in the wake of the French Revolution. He was born a slave, but was freed by his owners in 1777. In 1791, he joined a slave rebellion and assembled an army which he trained in guerrilla warfare. When France and Spain went to war in 1793, he and other black commanders joined the Spaniards. But in 1794, he switched his allegiance to the French because, unlike Spain, France had recently abolished slavery. His revolt created the first independent nation in Latin America. Louverture rose from lieutenant governor to governor general of Saint-Domingue and gradually rid himself of the French. Treaties with the British ensured the French withdrawal, and Louverture began trade with the UK and the US. In 1801, he turned his attention to Santo Domingo, the Spanish-controlled portion of Hispaniola, driving out the Spanish and freeing the slaves there. He made himself governor-general for life, but his triumph was short-lived. In 1802, he was captured by the French and taken to France. He died a prisoner in a French fortress, a year before his country achieved full independence.
Toussaint was no longer a slave. He didn't have the mentality of a slave. He was the owner of 2 or 3 plantations. He was not of the same class anymore. His interests were different from the interests of the masses.
But Toussaint's first reaction to the raging violence was based neither on money nor race. It was personal. He went back to the plantation where he had been born to protect his former owners.
Now, unfortunately, Toussaint kind of saw himself as an honorary Frenchman and believed he could be equals and treated the same under French law. And don't get me wrong, Toussaint definitely fought for freedom and was a big part of the revolution. But even though he was enslaved himself, he helped the French people who enslaved him escape from the island when the violence was going down. He made sure that they didn't get hurt. Now, understand this. From what I understand, Toussaint was definitely about the liberation of black people globally. But he also did go out of his way to do things to help the French. Or at least he tried to offer his help, but they didn't want his help. He even offered like 5,000 or 6,000 soldiers to go help fight with the French in exchange for equal rights. But he was denied because they didn't want him to have equal rights, and they felt like he would have too much power.
We're going to get to a man called François Dominique Breda, born so-called in slavery. But I say no, he was born out of slavery, but when purchased, as they usually do, they changed his name to François Dominique Breda. Fine. He is going to grow. As he began to come into himself, he gets rid of the François. And what is the meaning of the word François? François means that which belongs to, is relative to France and its people. He gets rid of François. We find him Dominique Breda. He continues to fight. He gets rid of Dominique, and we find him Dominique, which means born on a Sunday. and we find him Toussaint Breda. And he gets rid of Breda as he comes to full knowledge of who he is and take his role as the one who opens the way and traces the road to independence. We find him Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint, the one who has the powers of all the saints, Louverture, to open the way. So, as we step 2, he does his job of opening the way and tracing the road. What do we find him doing in the last minutes, the last days of his existence here? We do not find Toussaint fighting to stay in power. We do not find Toussaint begging Leclerc to keep him here. We find Toussaint fighting so Dessalines will be named a divisionary general. We find him fighting for Christophe to have another rank. We find him fighting to place everybody where they should be. And his last word here in Gonaïves to his godfather, Pierre Simon Baptiste, when Pierre Simon Baptiste asked him, Toussaint, so you leaving us here? Toussaint smile and say, don't worry, everybody's in their post. The victory is already there. And he stepped onto the boat. It's called what they call history, which we call arstry, which is the story of all life forms on a particular space. So, the arstry is a string that goes on forever. There is no cutting this string. So, Toussaint does his work, and the next guy step up to lead the work of the people that are involved. People from Jamaica, people from Grenada, people from all over the islands have found ways to come in and participate. African Americans from the United States have come here and fought in this battle over here. But all of this is sort of obscured when you have these individual type situations. Women, Toussaint Louverture says to us, women represent more than a third of all fighting troops. Children are the first people to step on any battlefield. Where are they? In his story that they gave us. We don't see them.
Now, unlike Toussaint, many others felt like the Spanish were less cruel, and a lot of people allied with them. Now, mind you, neither the French, Spanish, or the British was offering freedom or equality. But understand, they used European tribal wars to their benefit. They used white-on-white crime between the British, the Spanish, and the French to eventually drive the French off the island. And the more ground the French lost, the more demands they were willing to meet from the Haitians, or at least the black families that sided and helped them in the war. But by then, Toussaint and the rebels had control of the entire northern part of the island. Now, one reason why they didn't accept Toussaint, Europeans have always had this fear of the Black Messiah. They felt he would have too much power. And one of them even predicted the rise of the Black Spartacus to lead his people into freedom.
Black Spartacus is basically the story of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. And it's based on the fact that Spartacus was a real person that lived in 60 BC, was a slave, a gladiator, who created an uprising among the other Roman slaves and freed them and spent about a good dozen years free from the Roman, from the oppressors. And so over the years, that name Spartacus became associated with someone who would free slaves. Abbé Raynal in the 16th century was a priest who was against slavery and wrote a book saying that his vision was there would be a black Spartacus. And actually, Toussaint Louverture read the book, was kind of an inspiration for him because he felt maybe he should be that black Spartacus. And actually, we all know what he did. And revolution happened and Haiti became the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere.
So Toussaint was inspired to lead his people to freedom. And he wrote a letter to the people promising them freedom if they would follow him and make him the leader. Now, I want you to understand, even though they have always feared the Black Messiah, one thing we have to understand is that revolution is not based off one person or one leader. A revolution is an energy. And even if that one leader gets taken out, there's going to be somebody else right there to step up to take his place and continue that revolution. What we have to understand is the Black Messiah is Black unity. But after Toussaint started leading the revolution, they start organizing and training their soldiers in the art of guerrilla warfare. And by 1795, slavery was abolished in Haiti. Now, even though Toussaint sided with the French and he encouraged others to do the same, Spain and France ended up reaching a peace treaty in 1795 and ended their war with what they call the Peace of Basel Treaty. Now, this treaty basically split the island of Hispaniola into two sections. One part, which we know as the Dominican Republic, or the DR, was controlled by Spain. And the other part, which was Haiti, was under French control. And it's ironic that sometimes we see brothers and sisters over there in between those two, what they call countries now, are split with each other, but it really goes back to this treaty. Now, before I go too far with the Haitian Revolution, because unfortunately it doesn't stop there, but I don't want this to be too long. But on the next session, we'll see more of how the Haitian Revolution affected the world, especially Black people globally, and the response by Europeans and the response by Black people globally, including the effects that it had on Black people in America, and how some Black people went over there to Haiti to help the people fight. Because in America at the time, the Spanish still owned the territory of Louisiana, right, after they took it from the French in 1762. Now, eventually, things kind of changed after the Haitian Revolution and the Louisiana Purchase. But during this time, the Spanish still controlled Louisiana. And the enslaved population there was planning their own rebellion, which was known as the Pointe Coupée Conspiracy.
The Conspiracy of Pointe Coupée, Louisiana. Rumors of revolution and egalitarian ideas travel by word of mouth throughout the world of the enslaved. Pointe Coupée Conspiracy began on the plantation of one of the wealthiest Louisiana planters and future political leaders, Julian Padres. Men outnumber women by more than 10-1 on the Padres plantation. Led by Padres' overseer Antoine Saracen, the rebels planned to set fire to several buildings and then use the confusion to seize weapons and kill their masters along with uncooperative Creole slaves. They coordinated with slaves from neighboring estates who were expected to strike simultaneously. They also included sympathetic whites in the plot, including a schoolteacher named Joseph Bouilleville, who had read the Declaration of the Rights of Man to slaves on nearby plantations. Betrayed by informants of the Tunica tribe, the trials took place in May of 1795. The trial ended with 23 enslaved people being hanged and their decapitated heads posted along the road. All 3 white men were deported and 2 were sentenced to 6 years forced labor in Havana. Of the 23 convicted, their heads were not placed along the road. The 23 severed heads were nailed to poles along the Mississippi River's banks, in keeping with the old tradition of exemplary punishment.
Now, before this uprising could even go down, they were betrayed by 2 Indian women who heard about it and ended up telling the authorities. Now, these 2 Indian girls said the slaves were planning to kill all white people, and they feared for their life if their rebellion was successful. But even though nothing happened, at least 23 people were executed, and they placed their heads on spikes along the Mississippi River, trying to send a message to other Black people not to rebel. In a response, the Spanish sent patrols to arrest anybody who was off their plantation or on the plantation where they weren't supposed to be. They were considered a quote-unquote stranger. And they raided just about every slave quarters from Louisiana to West Florida. They accused a free brother named Antonio Kofi Mina of being the ringleader of the rebellion, and he ended up getting deported to Havana. Now, during the same time, there was also rebellion against the Dutch and Curacao, led by an enslaved man named Tula Rigard.
Tula, also known as Tula Rigard, was an African man enslaved on the island of Curaçao in the Dutch West Indies, who liberated himself and led the Curaçao slave revolt of 1795. Tula bore the nickname of Rigard, named after the Haitian general Benoit Joseph Rigard, one of the heroes of the Haitian Revolution. Tula was a slave field worker on plantation Nip, owned by Caspar Lodewijk van Utrecht. He was aware of the French Revolution and the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. He knew that the French revolutionary regime had occupied a large part of Europe and that this regime wanted to abolish slavery in the French colonies. Netherlands was placed under French rule. It was Tula's conviction that slavery would soon be abolished here, in Curaçao, as well. In 1795, the slave population of Curaçao, a former Danish colony in the Caribbean, staged a month-long revolt that threw much of the island into chaos. Father Jacobus Schneek, who was sent during the revolt in 1795 by the colonial government as a mediator to meet with the rebellious slaves, is the only one who had spoken with Tula, whose recordings are preserved in the government archives. His account starts on August 19th when he spoke with Captain Tula at Plantation House, Porto Mari, at 8:30 in the evening. As Father Schneek conveyed the proposals of the government to Tula, Mr. van der Grijp, a horseman captured by the rebels, heard the rebels say in French, "Le cure vient ici pour nous cajoler." The priest comes here to flatter us. Schneek also heard the rebels softly singing French revolutionary songs at night. The revolt, which began on August 17, 1795, lasted for more than a month. After the revolt was quelled, Tula was sentenced to death. The execution took place on October 3, 1795 at Rif, the Reef, on the south coast of the island in Otrobanda. Little is known about Tula's personal life, not even from official documents that have been preserved. Reverend Bosch, who arrived in Curaçao in 1816, wrote that he had spoken to people that had personally known Tula. They recalled him as articulate and a man of great stature. He is revered in Curaçao today as a fighter for human rights and independence.
The month-long Curaçao slave revolt of 1795 was led by a slave named Tula. He worked as a slave in a Dutch colony called Curaçao, which is located about 37 miles north of Venezuela's coastline. The revolt began at the Nip plantation, which is owned by Caspar Lodewijk van Utrecht at Bandebou. It began on the morning of August 17, 1795, and was carried out by Tula and about 50 other slaves. These slaves came together and informed their master that they wanted to be paid and that they would no longer live in bondage. They then traveled to several plantations to gather more men for the rebellion, beginning with Legume. While at Legume, Tula and his men went to the jail and helped 22 slaves escape. The rebels went to Santa Cruz, where Bastian Caparta led this group of slaves. The governor started to prepare his own militia to fight against the slave rebels after the son of Caspar Utrecht delivered a letter by horseback informing him about the rebellion. While Tula continued his raids, a Confederate French slave named Louis Mercier led his own group of slave rebels. Under Mercier's command, 10 mixed-race soldiers, as well as their commander, Van der Grijp, were taken as prisoners. Mercier also freed more slaves at the Nip plantation. Governor Joannes de Veer understood that the slaves meant business. He called on the 77 Navy seamen on the Medea ship to subdue the rebels. On August 19th, Lieutenant R.G. Pledger and his men met with Tula and his men at their camping ground in Porto Mari. Unfortunately for Pledger, he and his men were defeated. Pedro Wakio started another rebellion on his plantation. He gathered weapons and killed his master named Sable. A priest named Jacob Schenck was used by Governor Joannes de Veer to negotiate with Tula and his men. Tula would not settle for anything less than freedom. After 2 failed negotiations, the priest ordered the Dutch military to kill any slave holding a firearm. Ultimately, Tula won his battle. He carried on with this rebellion and was merciless against his enemies. Tula and other rebels poisoned whales and stole food in order to survive. Sadly, Tula and his men were betrayed by another slave. After being captured, Tula and his men, Louis Mercier, Bastian Caparta, Pedro Wakio, and other slave rebels were tortured to death and died on October 3, 1795. There is a monument of Tula on the south coast of Curaçao.
Now, Tula and 40 or 50 other slaves just told their enslaver that they weren't going to be slaves no more. And the slave owner said take it up with the authorities, but they just walked off the plantation. And then they freed 22 other people from prison. Now, these brothers went from plantation to plantation freeing people. And at the same time, another enslaved man named Louis Mercier, who was enslaved by the French, but he led another group of slaves doing the same thing. and they eventually took 10 mulatto slaves as prisoners. Now, these two groups ended up meeting at St. Croix, and most of the white people ended up fleeing from the city. Now, Tula and Louis knew about the Haitian Revolution, and since the Netherlands was controlled by the Dutch, which had been captured by the French, they felt that they were entitled to freedom, the same way that the Haitians felt like they was entitled to freedom. And they made demands to end the punishment of black people as a group. They demanded no more labor on Sundays, and they wanted freedom to conduct business for themselves without only going to their enslaver. And most importantly, they wanted to be paid for their labor and do business like buy their own food, clothes, or whatever they wanted. Now, even though that's all they were asking, 2 negotiations with the Dutch still failed. And so the Dutch ordered for anybody who was a part of it or who had a weapon to be killed. And they ended up murdering 22 people right then, but the rest of them managed to escape. But, they continued to fight back for months using poison and guerrilla warfare. But eventually, Tula was betrayed by another slave after he had got captured. Tula, Louis Mercer, and 2 other leaders were executed, along with a lot of other people, whether they were involved or not. But understand that people never stopped fighting for freedom. In Jamaica, Kingston, an Asante woman named Cuba Cornwallis, who was chosen by her people as the queen, and they gave her the title of the Queen of Kingston. But this sister used her knowledge of nature, of plants, to heal a lot of people, right? Bringing some people back from the brink of death. And some people even thought she had powers that could speak to animals and stuff like that. But this sister even saved what eventually became their king, meaning the British. But she was so popular, and when the British started to hear about the things she was doing, they started to get scared of her. They thought she was going to have too much power and too much influence. After all, they did call her the Queen of Kingston. So, of course, the British tried to deport her off the island. But the sister managed to escape, and she continued to fight back from Western Jamaica for years until they finally caught her.
Akua, or Cuba Cornwallis as she's known, was from the Ashanti Empire in Ghana. As a girl, she's captured and put on a slave ship. She survives and makes it to Jamaica, where she's purchased by Captain William Cornwallis. He has her as his housekeeper and nurse, and also has an affair with her. When he left Jamaica, Akua moves to Port Royal to escape slavery, and purchases a house and converts it into a hospice and hospital. She has her African knowledge of plants and herbs, and is very good at curing diseases using traditional West African spiritual practices, which the British are fearful of, but they work. She heals the broken bodies of Africans, cures soldiers and sailors. She held the fate of European history in her hands when she cured the prince who survived to be crowned King William IV.
Now, hopefully this is not too long, or I'm not adding too much stuff in there, but I do want to add one more thing before we end. While we're talking about these rebellions, decades before the Haitian Revolution, there was another rebellion also in Jamaica, which became known as Tacky's War or Tacky's Rebellion.
Tacky's Rebellion, Part 1, the Easter Rebellion of Port Maria. The island of Jamaica is revered for its beauty and culture, but in my opinion, it is an underrated island when it comes to the history of enslaved Africans revolting against their enslavers. Tacky was a Fonte chief of an Akan state in Ghana, who was said to be a ruler of the Komenda or the Koromansi people. That information I have not confirmed. Tacky was a wealthy chief with a high ranking among chiefs within the kingdom, who also spoke fluent English. Tacky's life went from being a chief in Ghana to a slave working in the fields of Jamaica. Tacky and others enslaved in Jamaica faced some of the harshest treatment of any slaves recorded. Tacky became an overseer on the plantation he worked. As the overseer, he began planning a rebellion with fellow slaves. Tacky had a vision of a Jamaica with a free colony of black people, absent of white oppression or influence.
To create this Jamaica, he would have to defeat the British. In 1759, he would escape from his plantation into the caves of Jamaica, accompanied by fellow Africans ready to fight for their freedom. They would plan the rebellion for a year before they officially attacked the slave masters. April of 1760 was the beginning of Taqui's rebellion, also known as the Easter Rebellion of Port Maria. In the early hours of Easter morning of 1760, Taqui and his followers began their rebellion. They first killed their slave masters on the plantations they worked. They immediately found themselves free and in charge of their own destinies, but they were well aware that this was only an initial defeat. Real freedom came with totally defeating the British. As they killed their enslavers, they gathered as many supplies, weapons, and ammunition as they needed. The number of rebels grew as more and more Africans killed their enslavers to join the rebellion. Easter Day was a bad day for the plantation owners of Jamaica. The Africans rebelled until early the next morning. The following morning, Taqui and his rebels celebrated their victories before continuing their plans to ensure their freedom. During their celebration, a cowardly African slipped away unnoticed, ran to the nearest plantation that wasn't ravaged by the Africans, and told the plans of the rebellion to the British. Taqui and the rebels either practiced, believed, or tolerated the Obeah spiritual tradition. Because of their belief in Obeah, they trusted that they would be protected by Obeah because an Obeah spiritualist cast a spell of protection over the rebels and ensured them that the weapons of the British could not harm them. The rebels were soon facing a British militia who were alerted of the rebellion by the person who sold out the rebels. Taqui and the rebels initially faced the British militia with confidence because of the belief in the protection of Obeah by the spiritualist. The British quickly killed the spiritualist and hung him by his own mask. This spooked a great number of the rebels because they believed they were protected. A number of them fled, but Taqui and the bravest stayed and fought the British. The rebels were fighting for their freedom and enraged that their spiritualist was murdered. As the rebels were gaining the upper hand, Maroons who were contracted to fight with the British joined the fight against the rebels. Taqui and the rebels were fighting for a month before Taqui was killed by a Maroon named Davy. Once Davy killed Taqui, he beheaded him and presented Taqui's head to the British. Taqui's death did not stop the rebellion. It only fueled the rebels to continue their fight. Taqui's rebellion was Jamaica's second longest rebellion behind the 30-year rebellion led by a brave woman named Brifu. May 25th, 1760 is the date that marks the beginning of the Western Revolt, a continuation of Taqui's rebellion. Apongo was a West African military leader. I do not have the information to confirm exactly where he is from in West Africa, but according to the diary of the English planter Thomas Thistlewood, Apongo was a prince in Guinea who paid homage to the king of Dahomey. After the death of Taqui, the rebellion was able to continue because of leaders like Apongo, as well as the organization of the rebellion. Apongo played an integral part in the planning and fighting in Taqui's rebellion, so his escaping capture and the death of Taqui was critical in the continuance of the rebellion. On May 25, 1760, Apongo and his fellow rebels signaled the start of the rebellion by shaving their heads, also the attack on the Maysmere estate in Westmoreland. Simon, a lieutenant in the rebellion, shot and killed John Smith, the managing attorney of the Maysmere estate. The Western Revolt was underway, led by Apongo. The rebels attacked the British when their naval escort was away from the island. Initially, the rebels faced a militia with fewer numbers than they would have if the British naval escort was present. Over the next 4 days, the rebels and the British fought back and forth, gaining and losing ground. May 29, 1760 was a key victory for Apongo and his fellow rebels. The British militia attempted to attack a rebel camp, but the rebels gained an overwhelming victory over the British, resulting in the rebel army gaining more members willing to fight the British for an all-black Jamaica. The British were suffering humiliating losses to Apongo and his rebels, so the British decided to call for an enormous amount of reinforcements. Reinforcements from the British 74th Regiment, 3 Maroon regiments, and 3 militias were deployed against the rebels to storm their encampment. The British were able to successfully breach the encampment due to the extreme reinforcements they gained. The rebels and the British battled for over 2 hours before the rebels were defeated. The militia killed men, women, and children of the rebels, even throwing some of the rebels off of a cliff. Despite the defeat, Opungo and the remaining rebels continued to wage war against the British from June 5th to July 3rd, which marked the death of Opungo. In total, over 400 rebels were killed during the rebellion, and 60 of the British militia were killed. Following the death of Opungo, several of the rebels were able to evade capture and hide in the mountains of Jamaica or escape the island completely.
Now, they say Tacky was kidnapped from Ghana, right, and ended up in Jamaica. But they planned to take over Jamaica and make it a black nation. And this was in 1760. So after they took over their plantation, they raided a gun store and they killed the owner. Then they took at least 40 guns and barrels of ammunition. And it didn't take long for hundreds of people to join them. Because you got to understand, people was ready to fight back. All they needed to see was somebody taking action. And then the people who needed to be there was there. Now, unfortunately, one of them left to go snitch to the British, right? Because there's always that one person that got to rat you out. Now, this is the thing when we talk about these rebellions. And unfortunately, a lot of times, the traitors who stop these rebellions. And you got to understand, by this time, Britain had treaties with the Maroons, or groups of Maroons, which were basically runaway slaves. And in exchange for their freedom, they agreed to be the slave patrol. And often, when they couldn't stop a rebellion, they would send in the Maroons, or the people who look like you. And they often stopped the rebellions that the Europeans knew that they couldn't stop themselves. And even though these black people were former slaves who escaped themselves to maintain their freedom, they would fight for the Europeans. And by the time Tacky's rebellion was over, 60 white people had been killed, but over 400 black people were killed, most of it fighting each other. Especially in places where black people were the majority, and if they had worked together, they would have easily taken over and they all would have been free. But either way, Tacky ended up getting captured and murdered. But many people continued to fight, like a brother named Opungo. He continued to lead the people into battle, because a rebellion isn't just one person, it's an energy. And if that leader goes down, then the next leader steps up. And another leader in a rebellion was an Asante queen, Queen Nanny, who was a powerful warrior herself who fought all the way to the end.
The Right Excellent Nanny of the Maroons is Jamaica's only heroine, and perhaps Portland's most infamous native.
She's an iconic figure in Jamaican history, and her legacy has been celebrated in poems, portraits, and currency.
Much of Nanny's early life is unknown, including her birthplace. What is certain, however, is that she, along with other enslaved people, sought refuge from a brutal slave society in the Blue and Jankro Mountains, where together they established a Maroon community.
It is often cited that under British rule, the Maroons were perhaps the first set of people to settle in Portland, and that it was this settlement, coupled with Portland's unfavorable climate, which deterred white settlement here.
But who exactly were the Maroons? And how did Nanny become their most powerful leader?
During the 15 to 1600s, enslaved Africans brought to Jamaica by the Spanish escaped into the Blue and Jankro Mountains, taking refuge with the Tainos, who had sacred sites deep in the interior of the island.
The enslaved Africans were called Cimarrones by the Spanish, a term the English would later translate to Maroons.
By 1640, the Maroons had established settlements in the east of the island. This group, consisting of 600 women and children and 300 men, were known as the Windward Maroons.
In 1655, when Britain captured Jamaica from Spain, it instituted a system of slavery that was so harsh that it resulted in a mass exodus of enslaved people who fled to the mountains, increasing the size of the Maroon settlements.
The capital of the settlement became known as the Great Negro Town, and later Nannytown.
The English insistence on settling these lands led to the outbreak of the Great Maroon War.
Beginning in 1725,
it was during the height of the Great War, 1728 to 1734, that the Maroons, under the leadership of Nanny,
and using their superior knowledge of the mountains, waged a successful guerrilla war against the British.
The British eventually relented with the signing of a peace treaty in 1739 with the Leeward Maroons, and in 1746 with the Windward Maroons. Though the details of Nanny's life are still shrouded in mystery,
she likely died in 1750.
Nanny remains a symbol of resistance and power in Jamaican history.
Now, before all of the rebellions that we just talked about, there was Queen Nanny. And she established one of the first communities for escaped black people and fought Europeans until the end. Established her own village, Nannytown. Now, some say she might have died in the 1730s. Some say 1760, but no one actually knows for sure. But she was a queen that didn't hesitate to fight in the battle herself. And today, she's the only woman hero recognized in Jamaica, you know, alongside people like Marcus Garvey. Even though there are people like Cuba Cornwallis or the Queen of Kingston. But Queen Nanny definitely needs to be recognized, and, you know, she's on money and is a hero in Jamaica. But anyway, we'll wrap it up here. And next time we'll get more into the Haitian Revolution and also, you know, the response from black people globally and the will to continue fighting for freedom. Now, I appreciate everybody for listening, and I appreciate everybody's support. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask, or any of the lessons that we talked about, feel free to ask. And again, man, think about creating your own course or creating something that you think our children need. But I appreciate y'all for listening. And as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.